She traveled 6 days on a freezing train to marry a stranger. And when she finally arrived, exhausted, hopeful, wearing her best dress that wasn't good enough anymore, he looked her up and down in front of the entire town and said, "You're not what I paid for," just like that, on a platform full of strangers. No apology, no shame, just a man's voice cutting through cold air while people watched and did nothing. That moment should have destroyed Eleanor Vale. Instead, it started something nobody in Blackridge saw coming. Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The train pulled into Blackridge at 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and the cold hit Eleanor Vale the moment she stepped onto the platform. A hard, mean cold that came off the mountains like a warning. She stood there for a second, just breathing it in, her travel bag clutched against her side, her eyes scanning the small crowd that had gathered near the station entrance. She didn't know what Calvin Mercer looked like. She'd described herself in her letters: brown hair, medium height, a small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall. And he'd written back that he would recognize her, that he would be waiting. So Eleanor straightened her coat, the one with the fraying hem she'd repaired twice with brown thread that didn't quite match, and she walked off that train the way a woman walks when she is terrified but refuses to show it. She was 31 years old. She had $14 and some loose change in her coat pocket. She had left nothing behind in St. Louis worth missing: a rented room above a tailor shop, a job that paid barely enough to eat, a city that had never once made her feel like she belonged in it. She had answered an advertisement in the back of a weekly paper, written 6 letters over 3 months to a man who promised her a house and a future in the West, and then she had packed one bag and gotten on a train. She told herself it was practical. She told herself she wasn't desperate. She wasn't entirely sure she believed either of those things. The platform was crowded enough. Ranchers, women with children, a few merchants in heavy coats. And Eleanor moved through the small groups carefully, searching faces. A man in his 40s with a trimmed beard caught her eye, and she thought for one lurching second, there. But he turned and kissed a woman on the cheek, and Eleanor looked away quickly, heat crawling up her neck. Then someone said her name. Eleanor Vale? She turned. Calvin Mercer was not what his letters had suggested. That wasn't entirely fair. His letters had never actually described himself in much detail, she realized now, which she had simply not paid close enough attention to at the time. He was tall, well-dressed in a merchant's coat that looked expensive, with a heavy watch chain across his vest. He had the broad, confident stance of a man who expected the world to arrange itself around him. And when he looked at Eleanor, he looked at her the way a man looks at something he's considering purchasing. His eyes moved over her slowly. Her coat, her bag, her boots, which were good boots but had seen a few winters. Her hands, which were reddened from the cold and from years of work. She watched his face change. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of change that happens when expectation meets reality and reality loses. "Mr. Mercer," she said, because she was not going to stand there in silence while he looked at her like that. "I'm Eleanor Vale. It's good to finally—" "You look older than I expected," he said. She stopped. Around them, a few people had glanced over. Nothing deliberate yet, just the casual attention of people near an interesting conversation. "I'm 31, she said carefully. "I mentioned that in my letters." "You mentioned it." He said it like the number meant something different in person. Then he looked at her coat again, that fraying hem, the thread that didn't match, and something settled into his expression. A decision. "I also expected someone more—" He paused, searching for the word with no particular hurry. "Presented." The word landed like a stone into still water. Eleanor felt the heat rise in her face. Not embarrassment yet. Not yet. Something harder than that. Something that gripped the back of her throat and made her want to speak very carefully. "I've been traveling for 6 days, Mr. Mercer," she said. "Yes, well." He straightened his coat, glanced around at the small cluster of people who had stopped pretending not to watch. And something happened to him then. Some shift. As though the audience made him larger, gave him permission. His voice rose just enough to carry. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about what I was looking for. You're not what I was expecting, Miss Vale. Not what I paid for. Not what I paid for." The words fell across the platform like a slap. Someone laughed. Just one person, quickly suppressed, but loud enough. A woman near the ticket window whispered something to her companion. Eleanor heard the words mail order, and can you imagine, without turning her head, because she could not turn her head right now. She could not move at all. She stood on that platform in her mismatched thread and her 6 days tired face, and she felt every eye on her, and she thought, this is the thing that breaks me. But it didn't, or rather, it almost did. There was a long second where the cold crept in through every seam of her coat, and the laughter from that one person rang in her ears, and she genuinely did not know if her legs would hold her. 6 days on a train, $14. The one good plan she'd had. And then she put the heat in her face somewhere useful. Then I believe we're finished here, she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that later. At the time, she just needed to not cry on a train platform in front of strangers, and she succeeded. And that was enough. Calvin Mercer blinked. He'd expected something, pleading, maybe, or an argument, a scene he could control. Eleanor Vale giving him nothing was apparently not what he'd prepared for. I'll need you to be on the morning train, he said, recovering. I've made arrangements, and I'd prefer this matter to be— I heard you, she said. She picked up her bag and walked away from him. She had nowhere to walk to. She understood that with perfect clarity with every step. She had no room booked, no money to book one, no person in this town who knew her name except the man she was walking away from. The station was behind her and the street stretched ahead, wide and frozen and utterly indifferent. She walked anyway. She found a bench at the far end of the platform, near a water trough that had a skin of ice over it, and she sat down, and she let herself sit with the reality of what had just happened. The crowd had mostly dispersed. The show was over. A few lingering looks from women passing by, not kind ones. And then she was alone in the way that is specific to public humiliation, which is a very particular kind of alone. Everyone has seen you. No one will acknowledge you. She counted her money. $14.30. A train ticket back east would cost her at least $8, maybe more. She hadn't eaten since that morning. That was Calvin Mercer. She looked up. A man was standing at a respectful distance, close enough to speak, but not so close as to be imposing. He was somewhere in his late 30s, with dark hair going gray at the temples, a carpenter's apron worn over a heavy coat, and the hands of someone who worked with them, scarred at the knuckles, chalky with sawdust along the creases. His face was the kind that was hard to read quickly, not unkind, not particularly warm either, just considering. I know who he was, Eleanor said. He does that sometimes. The man paused. Not always to that degree, but he's done it. She looked at him more carefully. He didn't seem to be offering sympathy so much as information, which she found she appreciated more than she expected to. Does it, she said flatly. His first wife left after 2 years. He said it without editorializing. He called it her fault. Eleanor didn't say anything to that. The man studied her for a moment, not the way Mercer had, not assessing value, more the way someone looks when they're trying to figure out a practical problem. You have somewhere to stay tonight? She considered lying. It would have been easier. But $14.30 was not a number that supported the energy required to maintain a lie. No, she said. He nodded slowly like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. I'm Elias Boone, he said. I have a carpentry shop at the edge of town and a cabin that needs more work than I have time for. I've got 2 kids and no housekeeper since Mrs. Farrow moved to Denver last winter. He stopped. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a situation that might be useful to both of us. Room and meals in exchange for whatever help you can give around the house until you get your feet under you. Eleanor stared at him. I don't know you, she said. No, he agreed. You don't. I could be anyone. So could I. He said it plainly, without defensiveness. You can ask around about me if it makes you feel better. George Pullman at the hardware store has known me 15 years. Reverend Aldous, too, if that matters to you. She looked out at the street. The sun was dropping behind the mountains, and the temperature was dropping with it. And the bench she was sitting on had begun to feel like a very obvious metaphor for her current situation. How old are your children? She said. Nathan is 12. Lily just turned 7. What happened to their mother? A pause. Not a reluctant one. More like he was picking the right words. She died 18 months ago. Fever. It was fast. I'm sorry, Eleanor said, and meant it. He nodded. So, can you cook? She almost laughed, the sheer practical bluntness of it. Yes, she said. I can cook. I can mend, clean, manage a household. I've been doing it since I was 9 years old. She looked at him directly. I won't pretend to be something I'm not, Mr. Boone. I'm not a saint, and I'm not a servant. If I work for you, I'll work hard, but I'll expect to be treated with basic respect. He met her eyes. I treat people with respect, he said simply. That's not a difficult thing. She picked up her bag. All right, she said, show me where this cabin is. The cabin was a 20-minute walk from the station, down a rutted road that ran along the edge of Black Ridge toward a line of pines. Elias carried her bag without asking, which she noticed but didn't comment on. He wasn't wrong that the cabin needed work. It was a good structure, solid logs, sound foundation. But the windows had gaps around the frames where cold came through, and one of the shutters hung at an angle that suggested the hinge had been broken for some time. The porch boards were weathered. There was a warmth coming from inside, but a stove burning somewhere. But the outside of the place had the look of a house that had been surviving rather than living. She understood that feeling completely. The door opened before they reached it, and Nathan was standing in the frame. He was 12, like his father had said, and he had his father's coloring, dark hair, serious eyes. But his expression was nothing like Elias's patient consideration. He looked at Eleanor with immediate, undisguised hostility, the kind that is honest in children precisely because they haven't yet learned to hide it. Who's she? He said. This is Miss Vale, Elias said. She's going to be helping around the house for a while. Why? Nathan. I'm asking a question. You're being rude. The boy's jaw tightened, but he stepped back from the door. Not welcoming, just yielding ground temporarily, the way someone does when they're choosing their battles. He didn't look at Eleanor again as she came inside. She stepped into the cabin and took stock of it the way she'd learned to take stock of things. Quickly, practically, without sentiment. A main room with a stone fireplace that needed cleaning. A kitchen space along the far wall that had the remnants of several meals on the counter. A table with 4 chairs, one of which had a crack down the seat. 2 doors leading to back rooms. A loft above. Everything functional. Nothing comfortable. Nothing comfortable except a little girl appeared from one of the back doors, pressed herself against the wall just inside the frame, and looked at Eleanor with enormous eyes. Lily. She was small for 7, and she had a smudge of something, flour, maybe, on her chin, and she was holding a wooden rabbit that had been repaired at the ear with a piece of string. She didn't run. She didn't smile. She just watched Eleanor from the doorway, the way a bird watches from a fence, ready to move, but not moving yet. Hello, Eleanor said. Lily said nothing, but she didn't retreat either. Elias set Eleanor's bag down near the fireplace. There's a small room off the kitchen, he said. Mrs. Farrow used it. It's small. I'll see it in a moment, Eleanor said. She was looking at the fireplace. When did this last get cleaned? A pause. It's been a while. The chimney drawer will be off. She moved to the kitchen, not asking permission, just moving because she needed to move or she was going to start thinking about that train platform again. What do you have in the larder? Elias followed her, slightly surprised by the directness. Not a great deal. I haven't had time to... Salt pork, dried beans? Any root vegetables? Some, yes. That's enough for tonight. She found a pot, found the shelf with the dried beans, and began the businesslike process of doing the one thing she knew for certain she could do right now, which was feed people. Her hands didn't shake. She made sure of that. Nathan stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her with arms crossed and jaw set. I don't want her here, he said to his father, as though Eleanor were not present. Nathan, she's just here because she doesn't have anywhere else to go. She's not going to stay. Eleanor kept her hands moving. Salt pork into the pot. Water from the barrel. She didn't turn around. You might be right, she said, addressing the pot. I don't know yet how long I'll be here, but I'm here tonight, and tonight there's going to be a hot meal, so you might as well sit down. Silence. Then, from somewhere behind her, she heard the scrape of a chair. Not warm, not welcoming, just yielding. She'd take it. The first week was not easy. Eleanor repaired the window frames with strips of rags and pine pitch, which worked imperfectly, but better than nothing. She cleaned the fireplace, which was grimier than she'd initially thought, and the first time she got a proper draw going, Lily stood in the middle of the room and watched the flames with an expression that made Eleanor look away fast. She cleaned years of accumulated neglect from the kitchen shelves. She mended 3 of Nathan's shirts, which she found stuffed under the mattress in the loft. Presumably, because they'd been there so long he'd forgotten about them. She made bread twice, beans and cornbread once, a rabbit stew when Elias came home with a brace of them from setting traps. She also made mistakes. She miscalculated the stove's temperament on the second day and burned the cornbread black on the bottom, and Nathan ate it in pointed silence. She broke one of the mismatched plates, reaching it down from a high shelf, and felt the crack of it through her whole chest, immediately crouching to pick up the pieces like she could undo it. She reorganized the kitchen shelves in a way that made intuitive sense to her and made Elias stand in front of them for a long, confused moment before asking if she'd moved the salt. "I can move it back," she said. "No," he said, still studying the shelves. "No, this makes more sense, actually." She slept in the small room off the kitchen that smelled of old herbs and wood shavings and was barely big enough to turn around in, and she lay awake those first nights listening to the sounds of the cabin settling and thinking about what came next. She had not stopped moving long enough to be frightened during the days. The nights were different. There was a plan, technically. Work here until she had enough money for a train ticket, and then east, maybe. Not St. Louis. Somewhere. Start again, differently, with whatever she'd learned. It was not a plan with much substance to it, but it was a direction. The problem was that the town already had opinions about her. She discovered this on the fourth day when she walked to the general store for flour and found conversation stopping in a way that had nothing to do with her being a stranger. By then, the story of her arrival had apparently traveled through Black Ridge thoroughly. The mail-order bride, the rejection on the platform, the charitable arrangement with the widower and his motherless children. She could see the shape of it in the way women looked at her, not exactly cruel, but measuring, deciding. The woman behind the counter, whose name Eleanor did not yet know, counted her change twice before handing it over. Walking back, a group of women from the church social, she could tell by the pamphlets one of them held, stopped their conversation as she passed, and then she heard, very clearly, no shame at all from behind her. She did not turn around. She set the flour on Elias's kitchen shelf in the spot she'd designated for it, and she washed her hands, and she did not say anything to anyone about what had happened at the store, because there was nothing to say. She had known people like that in St. Louis, too. She had known people like that everywhere she'd ever lived, which was several places, none of which had become home. She went back to work. Nathan broke eventually. Not kindly. It wasn't like that. He didn't suddenly decide he liked her. He just had a moment, 12 days in, when he came home from school with a bruised lip and dried blood under his nose, and he sat at the table not talking, not eating the supper Eleanor had made, not doing anything except sitting there with his jaw rigid and his eyes somewhere else. Lily watched him from across the table. Eleanor watched the both of them. "Someone hit you," she said, because someone clearly had. "It's nothing. It doesn't look like nothing." "I said it's nothing." He picked up his fork, put it back down. "Can you stop looking at me?" "I can," she said. "Do you want a cloth for that lip or not?" A long pause. "Fine," he said. She brought a wet cloth and set it on the table beside him without touching him, because he didn't want her to touch him. And that was legitimate, and she was not going to push it. He pressed it to his lip and stared at the table. "They said things," he said finally, in the specific tone of someone trying not to sound like they care as much as they care. About you being here." Eleanor sat down across from him. "What kind of things?" "That you're using him." His eyes came up to hers, direct and hard. "My father. That you're staying here because you're, I don't know, that it's not right. That you're—" He stopped. "I told them to shut up." "That's why your lip looks like that," she said. "They said things about my mother, too." He said it like he was reporting a fact. That she'd beat. He stopped again, jaw working. Eleanor looked at him. 12 years old, defending a woman he didn't even like against people who had no right to say a thing. She didn't know what to do with that. She wasn't sure there was anything to do with it. "Nathan," she said carefully, "you don't have to defend me. I know that. I mean it. It's not your job." "I know." He pressed the cloth harder against his lip. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because they were saying things about my mother." She nodded. "I understand. Don't make it into something it's not." "I'm not," she said. They sat there for a moment, two of them, on opposite sides of a table, and a great deal of grief. And the fire burned in the grate, and Lily quietly got up and put her wooden rabbit on Nathan's side of the table without saying anything at all, and Nathan looked at it for a long time before he reached out and pushed it back to her, but gently. The blizzard came in the third week of November, and it came with no patience. By afternoon, the sky had gone the specific gray-white that people in Blackridge apparently knew to mean get inside, and Elias wasn't home by dark. He'd gone to his workshop on the other side of town that morning with a commissioned job that needed finishing, and he'd said he'd be back before supper, and he wasn't. Eleanor fed the children, got Lily into bed, watched Nathan stare at the window. "He's done this before," Nathan said. It sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "He stays at the workshop sometimes when he's in the middle of something." "In weather like this?" The boy didn't answer that. She looked at the window. The snow was piling against it horizontally, which meant the wind had turned bad. She thought about a man alone in a workshop across town in weather that was getting worse by the hour. She thought about what it would mean for these children if something happened to him. "Where's the workshop?" she said. "You're not going out there." "Where is it, Nathan?" His face did something complicated. "Past the mill, down by the creek bed." He looked at her like he expected her to realize how unreasonable this was. "You can't find it in the dark. Is there a lantern?" He stared at her. She found a lantern and her coat and her boots, and Nathan grabbed her arm as she was heading for the door. Not hard, not a full stop, just a hand on her arm. "You'll get lost," he said. "Maybe," she said. His hand dropped. She thought he might argue more, but he didn't. He just stood there with a look on his face she couldn't entirely read, and said, "Past the mill. There's a big split pine on the left side of the road. The workshop's set back from it, maybe 30 yards. "Thank you," she said. She went out into the storm. It was, without qualification, the worst walk of her life. The wind was not metaphorical in its cruelty. It was physical, a thing with intention, driving snow horizontally across her vision and turning the lantern light into a small, useless glow that showed her approximately 2 feet of frozen ground at any given time. She lost the road twice and found it again by sheer stubbornness. And the cold was the kind that moves through clothing like clothing isn't there. And she couldn't feel her face by the time she found the mill. Split pine. Left side of the road. She found it. She didn't know how. She found the track leading back from it, and she followed it, and the workshop appeared in the dark like something dreamed, a square of orange light in a window. She hit the door with her shoulder because her hands couldn't manage the latch. The door came open and Elias looked up from his workbench with an expression that went through surprise and alarm in the same second, and then he was on his feet crossing the room, and his hands, carpenter's hands, rough and capable, came up to catch her by the arms as she came in out of the cold. "Eleanor, I couldn't—" She couldn't get the sentence organized. Her teeth were chattering too hard. "I couldn't tell if you— What in God's name were you—" He stopped. He was holding her by both arms, looking at her face, which was probably the color of old paper at that point. Snow came off her coat in a small cascade as she stopped moving. The workshop was warm. A stove burning in the corner, sawdust on the floor, the smell of pine and varnish. She felt the warmth hit her like something solid. "I thought something might have happened," she said. She was aware she sounded reasonable. She felt completely unreasonable. The children were worried. He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face that she didn't know how to name. Not quite the expression she'd seen from him before. Something newer than that. "I lost track of the time," he said, quieter. "I was finishing the cabinet and I—" He stopped. "You came through that alone." The lantern helped. "The lantern is a joke in that wind and you know it." His voice was rough. "You could have—" "I know," she said. They stood there close together in the warm workshop while the blizzard threw itself against the walls outside, and Eleanor thought that she should probably step back. Give him his space. She was standing very close to a man she had known for 3 weeks and had no business being close to. She didn't step back. Neither did he. "Why did you come, Seth?" he said. Not accusing, genuinely asking. She thought about lying. About saying the children needed you and leaving it there because that was true and that was clean and it would not open any door she needed to keep closed. But she'd told him that very first night she wouldn't pretend. "Because you were out there," she said, "and someone should know where you are." He looked at her. The stove crackled. Snow beat against the window. "Nobody's gone looking for me in a long time," he said. She didn't say anything to that, but she didn't look away either. They stayed in the workshop until the worst of the wind died down around midnight. Then Elias walked her home through the quieter aftermath of the storm, his lantern and hers making two small pools of light on the white ground. And they didn't talk much, but the silence between them had changed into something neither of them was quite ready to name. The cabin was warm when they got back. Nathan was awake in the chair by the fire, arms crossed, doing a very good impression of someone who had not been worried at all. He looked at his father. He looked at Eleanor. He said nothing. But in the morning, for the first time, he asked Eleanor if she'd teach him how she made the bread. She did. It was a start. The bread lesson lasted an hour and a half and produced one acceptable loaf and one that came out lopsided on the left side because Nathan had rushed the second kneading. "You can't skip steps," Eleanor told him. "I didn't skip it. I shortened it." Same thing. He looked at the lopsided loaf with the specific expression of a 12-year-old who knows he's wrong and is not going to say so. Then he cut himself a piece anyway and ate it standing over the counter, and Eleanor turned back to the stove before he could see that she was almost smiling. That was the thing about Nathan. He didn't warm up in any way that could be called warming up. He just gradually stopped being cold in specific situations. He would ask her a practical question in the kitchen and then disappear to the loft before she could make anything of it. He would set an extra place at the table before she asked. He would come home from school, register that she'd done something to the cabin, fixed a hinge, patched a wall, and say nothing at all, but she'd catch him looking at it later with a measuring kind of attention, the way his father sometimes looked at a piece of work. Lily was different. Lily came to her sideways. It started with small things. The wooden rabbit appearing on the kitchen counter while Eleanor was cooking, then disappearing when she turned around. A drawing slid under the door of her small room one morning, a house with smoke coming from the chimney and 4 figures in front of it, drawn in a child's imprecise hand, no names written on anything. Eleanor pinned it to the wall of her room with a nail and said nothing about it at dinner. 2 days later there was another drawing next to it when she woke up. She didn't know when Lily came in. She slept lightly. She always had. And she hadn't heard the door, which meant the girl moved like smoke when she wanted to. Eleanor thought about saying something and decided against it. The drawings were a kind of conversation. She didn't want to make it into something that would make the child stop. So instead, on a Tuesday afternoon when Lily was sitting at the table with paper and a stub of charcoal pencil, Eleanor sat down across from her with the mending basket and worked quietly. And Lily drew quietly, and they occupied the same space without demand, the way 2 people can sometimes just be in a room together without it meaning anything more than that. After a while, Lily said, without looking up from her drawing, "Are you going to leave?" Eleanor kept her hands moving on the shirt she was hemming. "I don't know," she said. Lily's pencil stopped. "That's not the same as no." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It isn't." The pencil started again. "Mama said she'd always be here, and then she wasn't." Lily said it matter-of-factly, with the flatness of a child who has processed a thing enough times that the words have worn smooth, even if the thing underneath hasn't. She didn't mean to not be here, but she still wasn't. Eleanor set the mending down. She looked at Lily's bent head, the small, careful way she was shading something on the paper. "I know," she said, "and I'm not going to pretend I can promise you something I can't promise. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm figuring things out." Lily looked up then, briefly, with those serious eyes. "Do you want to stay?" It was not a question Eleanor had let herself ask. She'd been too busy with the practical, the windows, the bread, the shirts, the stove, to sit down with the wanting. Wanting things had not historically served her well. She'd wanted a home in St. Louis and gotten a rented room. She'd wanted a future and gotten a train platform and a man who looked at her like she'd disappointed him just by existing. But Lily was 7, and she was asking an honest question, and she deserved something better than a deflection. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I think I do." Lily looked at her for another moment, then went back to her drawing. She turned it around when she was done and pushed it across the table. It was the cabin again, but this time there were flowers in front of it that didn't exist in November, and there were only 2 figures out front, a small one and a taller one. Eleanor took it upstairs when she went to bed that night and pinned it next to the others. She lay in the dark for a while thinking about the word want, and how dangerous it was, and how she'd said it out loud anyway. The problem was, she was beginning to understand that want had gotten considerably more complicated than just the cabin and the children. She was not going to examine that. Not yet. The town, however, was not going to give her the courtesy of time. It was Agnes Whitmore who started it in the open, though Eleanor suspected she'd been stoking the conversation privately for weeks. Agnes ran the church social committee with the authority of a woman who had decided that organizing other people's moral lives was her primary occupation, and she had opinions about Eleanor Vale that she had apparently been aging like wine until they were ready to serve. Eleanor met her properly, if properly was the word, at the general store on a Wednesday morning in early December when the temperature had dropped again and the sky had the tight gray look of more snow coming. She was reaching for a tin of salt when Agnes Whitmore materialized beside her with two companions whose names she didn't yet know, and said, with the particular brightness of someone who has been waiting for an opportunity, "Miss Vale, I've been hoping to have a word." Eleanor put the salt tin in her basket. "Mrs. Whitmore." "We've been concerned," Agnes said. The "we" was careful. It implied a collective weight, a community position, not just one woman's opinion, about the situation at the Boone household. "What situation is that?" Eleanor said, not as a question. "Well," Agnes's companions exchanged a look. "A single woman living in a widower's home with no formal arrangement." "I work for my room and board," Eleanor said. "That's an arrangement." "It's not a proper arrangement." Agnes said the word proper the way some people say the name of a disease. "People are talking, Miss Vale. I'm sure you're aware. Mr. Boone is a well-regarded man in this community, and his children are fed and warm and have mended clothes," Eleanor said. "I'm not sure what your concern is with that." Agnes's mouth tightened at the corners. The brightness dropped just slightly, replaced by something more direct. "My concern is with appearances, with what this looks like to the community. A woman who came here under the circumstances you arrived under, living in a man's home without a proper reason. I gave you my reason. You gave me an explanation." Agnes stepped slightly closer, lowering her voice in a way that was somehow more pointed than if she'd spoken at full volume. "I'm telling you what people are saying, that you're making yourself comfortable somewhere you have no right to be comfortable, that you're taking advantage of a grieving man and his motherless children for your own security." She paused. "I'm only telling you so you understand the position you've put yourself in." Eleanor looked at her. The store had gone quiet in the specific way that means everyone is pretending not to listen. "Thank you for your concern," she said. She paid for her salt and her flour, and she left the store and she walked the whole road back to the cabin without looking at anything. And when she got inside, she set the basket on the kitchen counter and stood with her hands flat on the wood for a moment, just breathing. Elias was in the workshop behind the cabin. She could hear the muffled sound of sawing. Lily was at the table with her drawings. Nathan was at school. She was not going to be run out of this cabin by Agnes Whitmore. She started on the bread. But the conversation had planted something, not doubt about herself. She'd been through enough that other people's opinions had limited power over her sense of her own worth. What it planted was doubt about Elias, about whether her presence here was, in fact, making his life harder in ways he was too decent to say. He'd offered her a practical arrangement and she'd accepted it, and neither of them had anticipated the town's reaction, and he had two children who were already navigating enough. That evening, after the children were in bed, she stayed at the table while Elias sat near the fire looking over some measurements for a job. She'd been trying to figure out how to start the conversation for an hour. "Agnes Whitmore spoke to me today," she said. He didn't look up from the paper. "I figured she would eventually. She's not the only one." "No." He set the paper down. "I know." She looked at the table. "If my being here is causing problems for you, Eleanor, I'm serious. If it's affecting your business, your reputation, if the children are having—" "Nathan already told me about the fights at school," he said. He said it evenly, but she could hear the tightness under it. "He also told me he started at least one of them himself. That doesn't make it better." "No." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her directly. "It doesn't. But the solution to that is not you leaving. The solution to that is people in this town learning to mind their own affairs, which they won't, but that's not your problem to solve by removing yourself from it." She looked at him. "They're saying I'm taking advantage of you." Something crossed his face. Not quite amusement, not quite frustration. "I know what they're saying. And I've known Agnes Whitmore for 11 years, and I've watched her drive two families out of this town with her particular brand of concern. He picked up the paper again, then set it back down like he couldn't quite settle. You work harder than anyone I've had in this house. You've done more for Nathan and Lily in 6 weeks than... He stopped. Started again. I know what I see. I don't particularly care what Agnes Whitmore sees. Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment. The fire burned. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. I broke one of your plates, she said. He blinked. What? In the 2nd week, I was reaching for it and I knocked it off the shelf and it broke. I've been meaning to say something. He stared at her. Then he said, Which plate? The blue one with the crack already in it. That plate was cracked before you got here. I know, I broke it the rest of the way. He looked at her for a second, and then something in his face let go of whatever it had been holding, and he laughed. A short, tired, genuine laugh that she hadn't heard from him before. It changed his face, made him look younger and less burdened, and more like a man who had once, before everything, laughed easily. I'll add it to your account, he said. She felt something loosen in her chest. Fair enough, she said. She went to bed that night less certain of the plan she'd been maintaining, the careful, practical plan about train tickets and moving on, and more uncertain of everything else in a way that felt less like fear than it had before. Which was, if she was honest with herself, more frightening than the fear. December settled over Blackridge like it meant to stay permanently, which it more or less did. The days shortened to the point where Eleanor was lighting the lamp by mid-afternoon, and the cold was a constant presence that required management, keeping the fire fed, keeping the drafts out, keeping Lily's thin coat mended, and Nathan's boots from leaking at the sole. Elias came home most evenings with sawdust in his hair and the worn, specific tiredness of a man who worked with his body, and he would eat and sit with the children for an hour, and then go over his books or his plans by the fire. And Eleanor would do the same at the other end of the table with the mending, and they occupied the evenings in a parallel quiet that was almost comfortable. Almost. She was aware of him in a way she hadn't been aware of anyone in a long time. Not constantly. She was too practical for that kind of continuous distraction. But in specific, inconvenient moments. The way he sometimes put his hand briefly on Nathan's shoulder when he passed the boy, without making it a thing. The way he listened when she talked, actually listened, with attention, not the half-listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak. The way he'd looked at her in the workshop doorway during the blizzard, holding her by both arms in the warm, sawdust-smelling room while the storm threw itself at the walls. She was not going to do anything about this. That was clear. The situation was already complicated enough without her turning it into something it wasn't and couldn't be. She was a woman in a practical arrangement in a man's house, and she had a plan to leave, and she was going to execute that plan with her dignity intact. She told herself this several times over the course of December. She was less convincing each time, Nathan noticed. Of course he did. He was 12 and sharp-eyed and had grown up watching two adults occupy a space together, learning the grammar of it before he had words for what he was reading. He said nothing directly. Nathan rarely said anything directly. But he started appearing in rooms where the two of them were talking, in the particular way of a child who is monitoring a situation. Eleanor ignored this with great deliberateness. What she didn't ignore was the afternoon she came in from hanging washing. Even in December, things needed to be washed. And found Nathan at the table with a letter, reading it with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something stripped of its usual armor. She set the empty basket down quietly. Nathan. He looked up. For once, he didn't arrange his face first. It's from my mother's sister, he said. She writes sometimes. Eleanor sat across from him. Good things? Mostly. He folded the letter carefully. She says she's been praying for us. A pause. She asks if father has remarried. There was nothing to say to that, so Eleanor said nothing. He won't, Nathan said. He said it like a statement of fact. He thinks he'd be replacing her. He can't see it any other way. He looked at Eleanor then with that direct, unguarded look that appeared sometimes when he forgot to be 12 and defended. I don't think it's replacing. I think it's different, but he won't listen to me about it. That's a complicated thing to think, Eleanor said carefully. She's dead, Nathan said. It was not cruel. It was just Nathan, direct to the edge of pain because he'd already sat with the pain long enough that he'd learned to say it plainly. She doesn't come back. But we're still here. Someone has to take care of things. Eleanor looked at him. He was folding and refolding the letter along its existing creases, not looking at her. Your father is doing the best he can, she said. I know. He set the letter down. I'm not saying he isn't. Another pause. I'm saying he should stop punishing himself for being alive. She didn't answer that. She thought about it all through making supper, and through the meal, and into the evening, the fire burning, and Lily drawing, and Nathan doing his schoolwork at the table, and Elias reading his measurements by the lamp. She looked at Elias, at the line of his jaw, the gray at his temples, the careful way he turned the pages of his notebook like he'd learned to treat everything in his life with a certain delicacy now, because delicate things broke. She looked away before he could catch her at it. But she thought about what Nathan had said. She was still thinking about it a week later when everything changed. It started, the way bad things often do, with someone entirely outside their household deciding they had unfinished business. Eleanor was at the general store on a Friday afternoon. She'd established a sort of détente with the woman behind the counter by this point, a guarded mutual acknowledgement rather than warmth, when she heard a voice behind her that stopped every muscle in her body. I was told I might find you here. She turned slowly. Calvin Mercer was standing in the doorway of the general store in his expensive coat, his heavy watch chain catching the thin December light, with an expression that was worse than the cruelty of the train platform. That had been contempt. This was something more calculated, something that had had time to harden into shape. Mr. Mercer, she said. Her voice stayed even. She would take that. I've been speaking with my lawyer, he said, stepping inside and letting the door close behind him. He was keeping his voice conversational, which made it worse. Interesting thing about mail-order bride contracts, Miss Vale. They're not as informal as people tend to assume. He tilted his head slightly. You left before our arrangement was legally discharged, which means it isn't. The store had gone very still. Eleanor held her basket. Her heart was doing something unpleasant in her chest, but her face, she decided, was not going to give him anything. Our arrangement was discharged the moment you publicly rejected me on a station platform, she said. That's not what the contract says. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper with the comfortable ease of a man who had practiced this moment. You are obligated, Miss Vale, to either fulfill the terms, which is to say, marry me, or repay in full the costs I incurred in bringing you west. Travel costs, correspondence costs, advertisement placement. He opened the paper. The figure comes to $140. $140. She had $14 and some cents when she arrived. She had somewhat more now, from the small wage Elias paid her, but not close to $140. Not within sight of it. She stood there in the general store with her basket and her even face and her heart hammering, and she thought, there it is. There's the floor. I'll need to consult someone, she said. Of course. Calvin folded the paper back with a small smile. You have until the end of the month, Miss Vale. I'd suggest you think carefully about your options. His eyes moved around the store briefly, taking inventory of the audience, and then back to her. I have some sympathy for your situation, which is why I'm giving you the choice. He left. The store stayed quiet for 3 full seconds after the door closed. Then noise resumed, conversation, the clink of things being weighed and counted, as if everyone had simply been holding their breath until the performance was over. Eleanor set her basket on the counter, paid for what she'd come for, and walked back to the Boone cabin in the cold. She didn't tell Elias that night. She sat through supper in the evening and the children going to bed, and she sat at the table after Elias had gone to check on something in the back, and she put her hands flat on the wood the way she had the first time Agnes Whitmore got to her, and she tried to think clearly. $140. 3 months of wages, maybe 4. Calvin would not wait 4 months. And even if she had the money, giving it to him felt wrong in a way she couldn't entirely articulate, like agreeing that he'd had the right to do what he'd done to her on that platform, like paying for her own humiliation. But marrying him was not a thing she was going to do. She knew that the way she knew things that existed below the level of argument. You're still up. She looked up. Elias was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, holding a lamp. She could tell him. She had told him she wouldn't pretend, and this was the exact kind of thing that not saying was pretending. Calvin Mercer came to the store today, she said. Elias went very still. She told him all of it. The contract, the figure, the end-of-month deadline. She laid it out plainly, the way she'd have laid out any practical problem, because that was what it was, and falling apart about it was not going to solve it. She kept her voice flat and factual, and when she was done, she looked at the table and waited. The silence lasted long enough that she looked up. Elias was sitting across from her now. She hadn't noticed him sit down, and his face had the specific set of a man doing controlled arithmetic on something that made him angry. The lamp between them made the shadows move. He planned this, Elias said. It wasn't a question. Probably, she said. He didn't come back here for another reason. Elias put his hands on the table. She noticed, not for the first time, how work-worn they were, how capable. He looked at them for a moment, and then he looked at her, and his expression was the most unguarded she'd ever seen it. I want to help you, he said. I want to be clear that I'm not saying this because I think you can't manage it yourself. I've seen how you manage things. A pause. But I want to help. You don't owe me anything, she said. I know I don't. He said it simply, without defensiveness. I'm not talking about owing. She looked at him across the lamp. The cabin settled around them in the cold. Somewhere outside, the wind was moving through the pines, and the fire was burning down in the grate. And Lily was asleep in her room dreaming whatever 7-year-olds dream, and Nathan was in the loft with his mother's sister's letter folded along its creases. What are you talking about then? She said. He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was quieter than she expected. I'm still trying to figure that out, he said. It was not a confession. It was not a declaration. It was just a man telling the truth about where he was, which was not a thing she'd been given very often by anyone, and she felt it settle somewhere in her chest like something that had been waiting for a place to land. She didn't say anything back. But she didn't move away either. They sat there on opposite sides of the table in the shrinking firelight, not saying whatever they weren't saying, until the lamp burned low and the cold pressed harder against the windows, and Eleanor finally pushed her chair back and said good night and went to her small room. She lay in the dark a long time before she slept. Outside it began to snow again, quietly this time. Nothing like the blizzard, just the steady, patient kind of snowfall that covers everything over and makes the world, for a few hours, look simpler than it is. He asked her on a Sunday. Not romantically. There was nothing romantic about it. Elias was not a man who did things romantically, and the situation did not call for it, and Eleanor would have been suspicious of romantic anyway by that point in her life. He asked her the way he made decisions about carpentry. He looked at the problem from several angles, determined what the most structurally sound solution was, and then said it plainly. She was washing the breakfast dishes when he came in from outside with cold still on his coat, and he stood near the doorway for a moment like he was deciding something, and then he said, I think you should marry me. Eleanor set down the plate she was holding very carefully. That's not a question, she said. No. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. I've been thinking about it since Friday, since you told me about Mercer and the contract. He put his hands flat on the table. That habit she'd noticed, the same one she had, pressing palms to wood when working something out. If you're my wife, legally, his contract is void. He has no claim on you. No court in the territory is going to rule in favor of a man trying to enforce a mail-order arrangement against a married woman. She turned around from the sink, looked at him. That's your reason, she said. It's the practical reason. He met her eyes. It's the reason that solves a legal problem by the end of the month. She noticed he didn't say it was the only reason. She also noticed that she noticed that, and she filed both things away without examining them. Elias. She came and sat across from him because this was not a conversation to have standing at a sink. This is your life, your name, your children's name. You can't just... I know what it is, he said. I've thought about that too. Nathan is 12 years old. He doesn't get a vote on whether you're protected from a man who is trying to use a legal document to coerce you. He paused. I'll talk to him. That's my responsibility. She looked at her hands on the table. They were reddened still, from the dishes, from the work. She was 31 years old, and she was sitting across from a man offering to marry her for the second time in her life, and this one, somehow, felt more terrifying than the first one, because the first one had never been real enough to be frightening. What does it look like, she said. Practically. What does the arrangement look like? He'd thought about that too. She could tell. Same as now, essentially. You have your room. You have your place here. Nothing changes on the outside. On paper, you're Mrs. Boone, which means Mercer's contract is worthless, and Agnes Whitmore and everyone else can redirect their energy towards something useful for once. A pause. When you decide you want to leave, if you decide that, we figure out the rest then, quietly, without drama. And you'd be comfortable with that. Something shifted in his face, briefly. I'd be comfortable with you being safe, he said. It was not a full answer. She didn't push it. I have a condition, she said. All right. We tell the truth. If people ask whether this is... She stopped, picked her words. I won't lie to the children. I won't tell Nathan this is something it isn't. He's old enough to know the situation. Elias was quiet for a moment. That's fair, he said. I mean it. No performance. No pretending to be something we're not to satisfy the town. It's a practical arrangement, and it stays a practical arrangement until... She stopped again. Until it isn't, he said quietly. She looked at him. He looked back. I'll talk to Nathan today, he said. She picked up the plate she'd set down and finished washing it, because her hands needed something to do, and because saying yes to something, even a practical something, required a moment of quiet to absorb. All right, she said to the dishwater. He didn't say anything, but he stayed at the table a minute longer before getting up, and she was aware of that, the way she'd become aware of all his specific movements in this house, against her better judgment and her careful intentions. The conversation with Nathan did not go smoothly. She wasn't there for it. Elias took the boy out to the workshop while Lily was napping, which Eleanor thought was probably the right instinct, giving Nathan a space where he could react without an audience. She sat with her mending and listened to the quality of the silence coming from outside, which told her nothing. Lily woke up and wandered out, and Eleanor braided her hair, and they played the quiet game they developed of Lily drawing while Eleanor mended, and Lily drew a picture of a horse that had too many legs, which she presented to Eleanor with complete seriousness. He has 6, Eleanor said. He's very fast, Lily explained. When Nathan came back inside, he came alone. Elias stayed in the workshop. Nathan stood in the doorway of the main room for a moment, looking at Eleanor and Lily at the table, and his face was doing the complicated thing it did when he was working through something that had too many pieces. He didn't say anything. He went up to the loft. He came down for supper and ate without speaking, which was not unusual enough to remark on. Lily talked about the horse drawing and whether horses could have 6 legs if they wanted to, which carried the conversation adequately. Elias ate and watched his son with the careful attention of a father who has done something he believes is right and is not entirely certain his child agrees. Afterward, when Lily was in bed and Elias was at the fire, Nathan came and sat across from Eleanor at the table where she was going over the household accounts. A task Elias had handed her 2 weeks ago with evident relief, having no talent for it himself. He sat down and looked at the accounts ledger and didn't say anything for long enough that Eleanor stopped pretending to work. You're going to tell me I should have expected this, he said. No, she said. I wasn't going to say anything unless you started talking. His jaw worked. Is it real? She considered lying. She'd agreed not to, but she considered it, the way you consider a door you're not going to open. It's a real legal marriage, she said. What it is beyond that, I don't entirely know yet. Nathan looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. My father hasn't looked at anyone since my mother died, he said. Not once. I watched for it because I was worried about him. A pause. He looks at you. She didn't say anything to that. I don't know if that makes it better or worse, Nathan said, in the voice of someone being genuinely honest about their own confusion. I don't know how to feel about it. You don't have to know yet, Eleanor said. You're 12. You're allowed to need time. I defended you, he said. It came out with an edge that was not directed at her exactly, more at the situation, at the general unfairness of things. At school, I got hit defending your name, and I wasn't doing it because I liked you. He stopped. I know, she said. And now she's going to be... He stopped again, pushed back from the table slightly. What do I call you? She hadn't thought about that. The question sat there between them with a weight neither of them had anticipated. Whatever feels right, she said, which might be nothing for a while, and that's fine too. He looked at the ledger, then back at her. Can you actually balance that, or are you just moving numbers around? The shift was so abrupt she almost missed it. I can balance it, she said carefully. Your father's filing system is creative, but I've worked with worse. Nathan almost said something that might have been a laugh. It wasn't quite, but it was closer than anything she'd gotten from him before. He pushed back from the table and went up to the loft, and Eleanor sat with the ledger and thought, this is what progress looks like when it's real. Nothing like you expected. Not clean, not warm, just incremental and imperfect and present, She could work with that. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning at the county clerk's office, because neither of them wanted a church ceremony, which was convenient since the church and its social committee had made their feelings about the situation abundantly clear. George Pullman from the hardware store acted as witness, because he was one of the 3 people in Blackridge who had treated Eleanor with consistent basic decency, and because he had 15 years of knowing Elias, and apparently felt that was worth showing up for. It was not a ceremony, it was paperwork. The clerk was efficient and professionally expressionless, and it took 11 minutes start to finish. And then Eleanor Vale's name on the documents became Eleanor Boone, and Calvin Mercer's contract became legally worthless. And Eleanor stood outside the clerk's office in the cold Thursday air with a marriage certificate she hadn't expected to have, and a last name that sat strangely on her like a coat that fit, but that she hadn't yet broken in. Elias stood beside her. George Pullman shook their hands and went back to his store. The street moved around them with the ordinary business of a December morning. "Well," Eleanor said. "Well," Elias agreed. There was a moment where neither of them quite knew what to do with their hands. Then they walked back toward the cabin in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was at least honest, which was more than she'd had from most silences in her life. The town found out by the following day. Towns always do. What Eleanor had not fully anticipated, though in hindsight she should have, was the specific texture of Blackridge's reaction. She'd expected disapproval. She'd prepared for Agnes Whitmore. What she hadn't calculated was the particular fury of people who felt they'd been denied the outcome they'd been expecting, which was Eleanor Vale eventually leaving and things returning to what they considered normal. A marriage was not leaving. A marriage was permanent. A marriage was Eleanor Vale becoming, legally and officially, part of a household that half the town had been in the process of deciding she had no right to be in. The first sign was the window. She found it on a Saturday morning. A rock had gone through the front window of the cabin sometime in the night, leaving a ragged hole and a spray of glass across the floor inside. It had missed the fire grate by 4 feet. Lily had been in her room, Nathan in the loft. Elias had been asleep in his room. Eleanor stood in front of the broken window in the early morning cold and looked at the hole and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "They are trying to frighten me." She knew the feeling. She'd had it before in different forms. A landlord in St. Louis who had raised her rent the week after she'd asked for repairs. A supervisor at a factory job who had cut her hours after she'd objected to something. The particular signature of power applying pressure to a person it expects to be easier to break than to accommodate. She got the broom. Elias found her sweeping glass when he came out. He stood in the doorway and looked at the window, and his face went through several things quickly before settling into something controlled and cold. "Did you hear anything?" he said. "No, I found it this morning." He went outside and looked at the ground, came back in. Said nothing for a moment, then, "I'll fix the window today." "I know you will," she said. She kept sweeping. After a moment he went to get his tools, and she swept the glass into a pile and thought about what it meant to stay in a place after someone had thrown a rock through your window, and what it meant to leave, and which of those things she was going to do. She swept the glass up. A week later, a note appeared wedged under the front door. She found it before Elias did, which she thought was probably the point. It was unsigned, written in a rough hand on a scrap of brown paper, and it said, "You don't belong here. You never did. Leave while you still can." She put it in the fire and said nothing to Elias. He found out anyway. Nathan saw it, having come downstairs early, and Nathan, whatever his complicated feelings about Eleanor's presence, had a 12-year-old's absolute moral certainty about certain things, and anonymous threatening notes were apparently among them. He told his father that evening with the gravity of someone reporting something that required attention. Elias looked at the fire where the note wasn't anymore. He looked at Eleanor. "You should have shown me," he said. "There was nothing to do about it. I would have liked to know." "And then what?" She kept her voice even, not because she wasn't frustrated, but because frustration wasn't going to solve the conversation. "You'd be angry, and you'd feel responsible, and nothing would change except you'd have spent the week carrying it. I've dealt with worse than anonymous notes." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" "The point is that this is my house." He said it not possessively but firmly, with the particular emphasis of a man trying to articulate something he's having trouble putting into words. "And you are—" He stopped. "I am what?" she said, and it came out quieter than she'd intended and more direct. The fire crackled. Nathan had retreated to the loft with the diplomatic instinct he was developing. Lily was already in bed. "You're not alone in this," Elias said finally. "That's what I'm trying to say. Whatever comes at this house, anonymous notes or broken windows or Agnes Whitmore and her whole committee, you're not managing it alone. That's what it means to—" He stopped again, looked at his hands. "That's what it should mean." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. She didn't show him the second note when it came. She was human and she was imperfect, and she'd been managing things alone for 20 years, and she was not going to undo that in a month. But she told him about it afterward, which was something, and he accepted that it was something even if it wasn't everything, and they understood each other, which was more than most people managed. Calvin Mercer was not quiet about the marriage. He appeared at the cabin 3 days after the news had spread, and he did not knock. He simply walked up to the porch and stood there until Elias came to the door, which took about 30 seconds because Eleanor had seen him coming up the path and said, "Elias," in a tone that communicated everything necessary. Mercer looked past Elias at Eleanor, who was standing in the main room behind him, and his expression was doing the thing it had done at the general store. That calculated, prepared quality. "I'd like to speak with Mrs. Boone," he said. He used the name deliberately. "You can speak with me," Elias said. He hadn't opened the door all the way. "This is a private matter." "Nothing about you and my wife is private," Elias said, and the word wife landed in a way Eleanor felt through her sternum, which she noted and did not examine. Mercer's jaw tightened. "Your marriage is fraudulent. You both know it, and I know it. I have a legal contract." "You have a contract with an unmarried woman," Elias said. "She's not an unmarried woman. You have nothing. I have a lawyer who disagrees." Mercer's voice was still controlled, but she could hear the heat under it now. "I have associates in this town who will testify that this marriage was arranged specifically to void a prior legal obligation, which constitutes fraud." "Then you'll need to take that to a judge," Elias said. "I intend to." "Then do it." Elias opened the door a fraction wider, not welcoming, not threatening, just making himself fully visible in the frame. "But don't come to my house again without a legal document in your hand. We're done here." He closed the door. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room and listened to Mercer's footsteps cross the porch and go down the path. Her heart was going too fast. She made herself breathe through it. Elias turned from the door and looked at her. "He's going to court," she said. "I know. He'll get people to testify. Agnes Whitmore. Probably half a dozen others who have opinions about this marriage already." "Probably," Elias said. He came further into the room and his face was calmer than the situation warranted, which she understood was not because he was untroubled, but because he had decided to be the solid thing in a room that was shaking. She sat down on the chair near the fire because her legs had decided the crisis was over, even though it wasn't. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't." "Elias, don't apologize for this." He sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "This is not something you caused. You answered an advertisement and got on a train in good faith, and a man failed to honor his end of it, and then decided you owed him for his own failure. That's not something you apologize for." She looked at the fire. "I keep thinking about what you're risking, your reputation, the business. If people decide—" "My reputation in this town has weathered things before," he said. "And the people who matter, George Pullman, Doc Haynes, a few others, none of them have treated either of us any differently." She turned her head to look at him. He was watching her with that quiet, measuring attention she'd been unable to get used to. Most people looked at her and saw the sum of her circumstances. He looked at her and seemed to see her, just her, which was more unsettling than contempt. "Why are you doing this?" she said, and it came out more raw than she'd planned. He didn't answer immediately. Not the way he sometimes didn't answer. This was different, more like he was trying to find the honest version rather than the easy one. "When Sarah died," he said, and the name came out careful, like something he still handled with deliberate care. I stopped. I stopped doing things for reasons that weren't entirely practical. I told myself it was grief. It might have been, but I think some of it was—" He stopped, started again. "I stopped believing that the non-practical reasons were real, that they counted." Eleanor held very still. "And then you walked into the storm to find me," he said, "for no practical reason at all. Because someone should know where I was." He looked at her. "I don't know how to explain what that did except to say I hadn't felt like someone's person in a long time." She couldn't say anything. She tried, and the words weren't there. I'm I know this situation is complicated, he said. I'm not putting anything on you. I'm just answering your question honestly. You said you were still figuring it out, she said, remembering the night after Mercer's first appearance, the lamp burning low between them. I'm still figuring it out, he said, but I know that much. She looked at him for a long time. The fire burned. Outside, the December wind moved through the pines in that low, steady way it had, the sound of a world that kept going regardless of what happened inside any particular cabin. She thought about what she'd told Lily. Yes, I think I want to stay. She thought about the plan, the train ticket, the next place, the fresh start that had always been just barely out of reach, the idea that somewhere there was a version of her life that wasn't provisional. She thought about Nathan asking her to teach him to make bread, about Lily's drawings pinned to the wall of her room, about a man walking her home through blizzard aftermath with 2 pools of lamplight on the white ground. I don't know what I'm doing, she said, because it was true, and he'd been honest with her and she owed him the same. Neither do I, he said. We cannot know together, if that helps. She almost laughed. It surprised her. That's a terrible comfort. It's the only kind I've got, he said, and it was enough. Not perfect, not resolved, not the beginning of something simple, but it was enough for that room and that evening and the situation they were actually in, which was 2 people who had each lost things they didn't fully know how to talk about, sitting next to a fire in a house that was gradually, imperfectly, becoming more than just a structure against the cold. She stayed where she was. He stayed where he was. The wind moved through the pines. 3 days later, the news came from Mercer's lawyer that a court petition had been filed. Eleanor read the summons at the kitchen table while Lily ate breakfast and Nathan got ready for school, and Elias stood by the window reading over her shoulder, and she felt the specific weight of a thing made official, moved from threat into fact, from possibility into procedure. She set the paper down. Lily was watching her with the antenna of a 7-year-old who registers adult tension through her skin. Is everything all right? Lily said. Yes, Eleanor said. You made a face. I have a lot of faces, Eleanor said. Eat your breakfast. Lily ate her breakfast. Nathan came downstairs, registered the paper on the table, registered his father's expression, and said nothing, which was its own kind of maturity. When the children had gone, Nathan to school, Lily to help at a neighbor's, a new arrangement that had developed in the last 2 weeks, Elias and Eleanor sat with the summons between them. The hearing was scheduled for the 2nd week of January. Calvin Mercer was claiming the marriage had been contracted fraudulently to void a prior legal obligation. He had 3 witnesses named in the filing: Agnes Whitmore, a man named Cotter, who ran the feed store and apparently had feelings about it, and his own lawyer. He's been planning this since before the wedding, Eleanor said. Yes. Elias was looking at the document with the expression she'd seen him use on structural problems, assessing, practical. We need a lawyer. We need a lawyer who isn't scared of Mercer's money. I know someone in Mill Haven. I did work for his family last year. He owes me a favor, and he's not from here, which matters. She looked up. You've already been thinking about this. Since Mercer showed up at the door. He met her eyes. I'm not going to let him take you. The words fell into the room simply, without drama, which was exactly the way Elias said the things that mattered most. He wasn't performing at her. He was just telling her the truth of what he was going to do, the same way he might tell her he'd fix the hinge or cut the firewood. She looked at the summons. She thought about the train platform, about not what I paid for, and the laughter from the crowd, and the cold bench at the edge of the platform where she'd counted $14.30. She thought about how far she was from that bench. We'll need to talk to the children, she said. I know. Nathan's going to want to understand what's happening. He will, Elias said. He's going to want to do something about it too. He's 12, I know. Something in Elias's voice, not quite pride, not quite worry, both. But he's 12 the way his mother was 12, with opinions. She looked at him when he said that, the first time she'd heard him speak of Sarah with something other than careful preservation. It was still careful, but it was different. Like a door that had been locked for a long time, opened just enough to let some air through. She didn't say anything about it. She let it be what it was. I'll write to the lawyer today, Elias said. Eleanor put her hand flat on the summons. Then she picked it up and folded it deliberately and put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept the household accounts. I'll make coffee, she said. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a turning point marked with music. It was a woman putting a frightening piece of paper in a drawer and making coffee. Because the practical things kept the world turning, and the world needed to keep turning, and there was still a family to feed and a house to manage and a court date to prepare for. But her hands were steady when she did it. She had not had steady hands on a train platform with $14 and nowhere to go. She noticed the difference. The lawyer's name was Robert Hale, and he arrived from Millhaven on a Tuesday afternoon with a leather case worn soft at the corners, and the particular manner of a man who had seen enough courtrooms to stop being impressed by them. He was somewhere in his 50s, with a gray beard trimmed close and reading glasses. He kept pushing up his nose, and he sat at Elias's kitchen table with a cup of coffee Eleanor had made, and read through the summons with the unhurried attention of someone who charged by the hour and knew it. "Mercer's lawyer is Thomas Weld," he said, not looking up. "I know Weld. He's competent and he's thorough, and he's going to argue that the marriage was contracted in bad faith, specifically to void a prior legal obligation." He turned a page. "He's not wrong that the timing looks convenient." "The timing was convenient," Eleanor said. "That was the point." Hale looked up at her over his glasses. "I appreciate the honesty. I'd appreciate it more if you don't say that in the courtroom." "I know what to say in a courtroom," she said. He studied her for a moment with the assessing look of a man recalibrating. "Good." He set the summons down. "The question isn't whether the marriage was expedient. Plenty of marriages are expedient. The question is whether it was fraudulent, meaning, did you enter into it with the intent to deceive the court or to illegally void a valid contract?" He looked between them. Was the contract valid? "Mercer rejected her publicly on the station platform in front of the entire town," Elias said. "He told her to be on the morning train." "In front of witnesses." "In front of approximately 30 people." Hale made a note. "Names?" "George Pullman was there. Doc Haynes's wife. Several others I can identify." "Good." He wrote something. The contract's enforceability was significantly weakened the moment he publicly refused to honor it. A judge with any sense will see that. The problem is Weld is going to argue around it, argue that Mercer's rejection was a momentary objection, not a legal discharge, and that you, he looked at Eleanor, had an obligation to pursue resolution rather than enter into another arrangement. "I had $14, she said flatly. "My options for pursuing resolution were limited." "I understand that. The court may or may not." He picked up his coffee. "What I need from both of you is a consistent account of this marriage. Not a romantic account, not a legal fiction, a true account of how two people came to a decision that was practical and is now—" He paused, looked between them carefully. "Is now what, exactly?" The question sat in the kitchen for a moment. Eleanor looked at the table. Elias looked at Eleanor. It was a brief look, but Hale was a man who made his living reading rooms, and he caught it, and he nodded to himself slightly and made another note. "A true account," Elias said, "of two people who made a practical decision and found that it became something more than that." Hale nodded. "That I can work with." He closed his case. "I need your witnesses to be at the hearing. Pullman, Doc Haynes's wife. Anyone who was at that platform. I need documentation of the broken window and the threatening notes." He looked at Eleanor. "You said you burned one of them." "Yes." "Don't burn the next one." "There hasn't been a next one." "There will be," he said, not unkindly. "Mercer is escalating, not retreating. He'll want to rattle you before the hearing." He stood, tucking the summons back into his case. 3 weeks. Keep your heads down, keep your account consistent, and don't let him provoke you into anything that looks like instability." He looked at Elias. "That includes you. If Mercer or any of his people come near this house, you walk away." "I understand," Elias said. "Good." He picked up his case. "For what it's worth, the contract argument is weak, and Mercer knows it. This is personal, not legal. He wants to win because losing to a widowed carpenter and a woman he publicly humiliated would be the kind of story this town tells for 20 years. He paused at the door. "Use that. A man acting on wounded pride is not a man thinking clearly. That tends to show in court." He left, and the cabin felt quieter and larger in his absence. Eleanor stood at the sink with her hands wrapped around her own coffee cup, now cold, and stared at the window. 3 weeks. She turned the number over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath it. "He thinks we can win," Elias said. "He thinks the legal argument is in our favor," she said. "That's not the same thing. Mercer has money and connections and 3 weeks to make our lives uncomfortable enough that we walk into that courtroom already off balance." "Then we don't let him." She turned around. He was still at the table, hands flat on the wood, looking at her with that steady quality she had come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of decision. Elias Boone had decided something, and when he decided things, he did not reverse them easily. She thought about the workshop in the blizzard, the way he'd held her by both arms. Someone should know where you are. She thought about how far she was from the woman on the bench at the end of the platform, counting coins. "All right," she said. They didn't speak of the hearing again that evening. They had supper, and Lily drew pictures of a horse with a more anatomically reasonable number of legs, and Nathan did his schoolwork at the table, and Elias went over his workshop orders for the week. It was an ordinary evening inside a situation that was not ordinary, and Eleanor thought that this was perhaps how people survived hard things, by insisting on the ordinary in between. The next morning she found another note, not under the door this time, tucked under the stone on the porch step, wrapped in oilcloth, as though whoever had left it wanted it to stay readable in the weather. She unwrapped it standing in the cold doorway, and read it, and went inside and put it in the kitchen drawer with the summons. She told Elias at breakfast. He looked at the drawer. "Can I read it?" he said. "Yes." She opened the drawer and handed it to him. He read it. His face did several things, none of which resulted in him saying what she could see he wanted to say. He folded it and put it back in the drawer. "I'll give it to Hale," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Are you frightened?" She thought about lying, not to protect him. She'd stopped doing that, but because the honest answer was complicated. "Not the way they want me to be," she said. "They want me to be frightened enough to leave. I'm not that kind. I'm the kind of frightened that makes me want to stay out of spite." She paused. "That's probably not the healthiest response." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said with complete seriousness, "I find it very reasonable." She almost smiled. He almost did too. The 2 weeks before the hearing tested things that the previous 2 months had not. The pressure from the town was not dramatic. It was the slow, grinding kind, the kind that works on you through accumulation. The general store's sudden inability to have Eleanor's regular order ready on time. A family that had been warming toward them going cool again, apparently after a conversation with Agnes Whitmore. Nathan coming home from school 3 days running with the particular set to his face that meant something had been said and he hadn't risen to it, which was its own kind of cost. But the thing that almost broke her had nothing to do with the town. It was a Wednesday evening, 8 days before the hearing, when she was in her small room going over the household accounts, and she heard Elias in the main room, moving around, the creak of the floorboards and the pattern she'd learned to read like a language. And then she heard something that stopped her pen. I was talking to himself. Not conversation, not even words, really. Just a low, quiet thing, and she would have left it entirely alone, except the door was not fully latched, and she caught the word Sarah. And then a long silence, and then something that was not a sentence but had grief in it, the specific gravity of grief that is not performing itself, that is not for any audience. She stayed absolutely still. She had known, intellectually, that he was still carrying his wife's death. He had told her as much, in the measured, careful way he told her things. She had thought she understood the weight of it, but hearing it in that unguarded moment, hearing what a man sounds like when he thinks no one is listening, was different. It was the difference between knowing a thing and knowing it. She put her pen down on the accounts page. She had agreed to a practical arrangement between 2 wounded people trying to survive. She had told herself that repeatedly, with the fervor of someone arguing against their own emotions. She had watched Elias Boone look at her in the workshop, had listened to him say I hadn't felt like someone's person in a long time, had felt the word wife land in her sternum when he said it on the porch to Calvin Mercer, and she had catalogued all of it carefully and filed it under things that are complicated and unresolved. She did not catalog this. This she sat with, in the small room with the lamp and the accounts and Lily's drawings on the wall, and she understood something that she had been not understanding for weeks. She was in love with a man who was still grieving his wife. Not over it. Not the Hollywood version of grief with a neat arc and a final tearful acceptance. Actually in it, still. Carrying it on an ordinary Wednesday evening in the main room while his children slept. And she understood something else. This was not a reason to leave. It was just the reality of who he was. A man who loved deeply enough that it didn't end when the person did. That was not a flaw. That was not an obstacle. It was the most human thing about him. She picked up her pen and went back to the accounts, and she let him have his quiet grief in the next room, and she did not mention it, not that night, and not ever. But she stopped pretending she was going to leave. She stopped pretending a lot of things. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the small room listening to the wind and going over the account she would give. Practical, consistent, true. She and Hale had gone through it twice. She knew what to say. She was not going to be rattled by Weld's questions, or by Mercer's presence, or by Agnes Whitmore's testimony, which she had been told would include detailed observations about the household and the arrangement and what Agnes had and hadn't witnessed. She was ready. She was also terrified, which she was aware of, and was choosing to set aside. She heard the door of her room open. She sat up fast, and Lily was standing in the doorway in her nightgown, holding the wooden rabbit, looking at Eleanor with wide-awake eyes. "I can't sleep," Lily said. Eleanor made room in the narrow bed. Lily climbed in without ceremony and lay there with the rabbit pressed to her chest, staring at the ceiling. "Are they going to make you leave?" Lily said. Eleanor looked at the ceiling too. She had promised herself she would not lie to this child. "I don't think so," she said. "Mr. Hale thinks the judge will see that Mr. Mercer doesn't have a real case." "But he might?" "He might," she said. Lily was quiet for a moment. "I don't want you to leave." "I know. I didn't want you to come," Lily said, with the stark honesty of a child who had decided to be accurate. "When Father said you were coming, I thought you'd be like Mrs. Farrow, who smelled like camphor and told me my drawings weren't useful." A pause. "You're not like that." "No," Eleanor said. "I'm not much like that." "You put my drawings on the wall," Lily said, like this was a matter of significant record. "They're good drawings. The horse had too many legs." "The first one did," Eleanor said. "You've been getting more anatomically reasonable." Lily made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Then she turned onto her side, facing Eleanor in the dark, and said very quietly, "I want you to be my mother." Eleanor held very still. She'd thought about this possibility in the abstract. She had not been prepared for it, said plainly, in a child's direct voice. In the dark, the night before a court hearing, she felt it go through her like something physical. "That's—" She stopped, started again. "That means a lot to me, Lily." "Is that a no?" "It's not a no," she said. "It's I don't know yet. Things are still being figured out." She turned her head. "But I want you to know that no matter what happens tomorrow or after, I'm not going anywhere because I want to go. Do you understand what I mean?" Lily looked at her. "You'd only go if they made you." "Yes." "And if they try to make you?" Eleanor thought about $14.30, about a bench at the end of a platform, about how far she was from that bench, and how differently her hands held things now. "They'd have a real fight on their hands," she said. Lily seemed to find this satisfactory. She settled back against the pillow and closed her eyes, and Eleanor lay in the dark listening to her breathe until the breathing went slow and even. And then she lay there a while longer, staring at the drawings on the wall that were just shapes in the dark. She was still awake at 4 in the morning when she heard the floorboard outside her door. The particular creak, third board from the left, that she knew meant someone in the hall. Then a pause. Then Elias's voice, very quiet. "Eleanor." She got up without waking Lily and eased the door open. He was in the hall in his work clothes, not having slept either by the look of him, holding a lamp low so it wouldn't reach under the children's doors. "I was going to make coffee," he said, in the way people say things they've thought about saying that turn out to be about something else. She came out into the hall and pulled the door almost closed. "How long have you been up?" "Since 2. He looked at her. In the lamplight his face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I keep thinking about things I should have done differently." "Such as?" "I should have gone to Mercer directly after he approached you at the store, before he filed. I should have—" "Elias." She said it quietly. Lily was sleeping 6 feet away. "You didn't cause this." "No, but I could have contained it better." His jaw was tight. "I keep thinking, I put you in this position. You came here with nothing and tried to build something, and I asked you to marry me for practical reasons, and now you're going into a courtroom tomorrow because of it. You asked me to marry you to protect me," she said. "And in doing so, I gave Mercer exactly the ammunition he needed." She looked at him in the lamplight, this careful, tired man who was apparently very good at finding angles from which to blame himself. She thought about what Nathan had said. He thinks he'd be replacing her. He can't see it any other way. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Yes." I was going to leave. She said it plainly because it needed to be plain. Before Mercer came back, I had a plan. Small wages, train ticket, somewhere east. A fresh start, which I've been attempting my whole life with mixed results. She watched his face. I stopped making that plan. Not because of the marriage, and not because of the legal situation. I stopped because... She paused, and this was the part she had not said aloud to anyone, not even herself in the small room late at night. Because this is the first place I've been where being needed and being wanted felt like the same thing. I don't know how to explain that better. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. That's enough, he said finally. That's more than I knew how to ask for. She looked at him. The lamp flickered slightly between them. She thought, I have been very careful. I have been so careful. She said, I'm in love with you. It came out quiet and matter of fact, because she was not a woman who could say the most significant things of her life in any other register. She watched him absorb it, saw the exact moment it landed, how it moved through his face. He reached out and put his hand against the side of her face. Just that. His work-rough thumb at her cheekbone, his fingers at the angle of her jaw. She felt the warmth of it go all the way down. I know I'm not, he started. I know, she said. I know where you are. I'm not asking you to be somewhere else. He looked at her. The lamp burned between them, low and steady, and then he kissed her. Not tentatively, not the careful, exploratory kind of first kiss between people who aren't sure, the kind that comes from having had the feeling for a long time and finally running out of reasons to keep it contained. She put her hand over his at her jaw, and they stood in the dark hall of the cabin while the January cold pressed against the walls, and Lily slept behind the almost closed door. And it was not a perfect moment because there were no perfect moments. But it was real in the way that only a few things in a life ever are. When they separated, she could hear her own heartbeat. After tomorrow, he said. Yes, she said. Whatever the ruling is. Whatever the ruling is, she agreed. She went back to her room. He went to make the coffee he'd said he was going to make. Outside, the first gray light of a January morning was beginning to show at the edge of the sky, and the town of Blackridge was waking up around them, and in a matter of hours they would walk into a courtroom and let a judge decide a question that had answers neither law nor contract could fully contain. She lay down beside the sleeping Lily and looked at the ceiling and felt the strange, inconvenient, poorly timed, absolutely real fact of being happy. Not content. Not settled. Happy. The kind with risk in it, the kind that has something to lose. She'd missed it more than she'd known. The hearing was at 10 in the morning. They walked into the county courthouse at 9:15, Eleanor, Elias, and Robert Hale, and the town had come with the specific enthusiasm that certain people reserve for public proceedings where the outcome is uncertain. The courtroom was a plain room with wooden benches and a judge's desk at the front, and it was full, which said something about Blackridge and probably not the best thing. Calvin Mercer was already there, with Thomas Weld beside him and a row of supporters behind him. Agnes Whitmore was in the front bench on his side, which was not a surprise. A man Eleanor didn't know, caught her from the feed store, sat beside her. Eleanor sat down and looked straight ahead. She heard them before she saw them. Feet on the wooden floor, 2 sets, moving down the aisle. She turned. Nathan was in his good shirt. He had not told them he was coming, had not asked permission, had simply arranged it, apparently having informed his teacher there was a family matter, and walked from the school to the courthouse, which was 2.5 miles, and which he had made in the cold in 40 minutes because he had his father's capacity for decision once he'd made one. Beside him was Lily, in her second-best dress, holding the wooden rabbit. Eleanor looked at Elias. He looked back at her with an expression that said he had not known and was not sure whether to be concerned or not. They sat behind Eleanor and Elias, Nathan straight-backed and silent, Lily pressed close to her brother's side. Nathan caught Eleanor's eye and gave her a look that said, I'm here. Don't make it into something. She didn't. The judge was a man named Calloway, who had the weathered face of someone who had been deciding things for a long time and had stopped being interested in drama. He called the hearing to order and read the petition and looked at both tables with equal disinterest. Weld argued first, and he was as competent as Hale had warned. He built the case methodically, the original contract, the correspondence, the costs incurred, the specific timing of the marriage relative to Mercer's legal claim. He was careful not to be theatrical about it. He simply laid the pieces out and let the logic do the work. Eleanor sat through it with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed, and she did not look at Mercer once. Hale was measured and precise. He put George Pullman on the stand, who described the station platform scene with the credibility of a man who had witnessed it and had no stake in anything except accuracy. He put Doc Haynes on the stand, who had treated Eleanor for cold exposure after the blizzard, which established, Hale explained to the judge, the nature of her relationship with the household before the marriage. He questioned Eleanor himself, briefly and cleanly, and she answered everything he asked without elaboration or emotion. Then Weld cross-examined. He was good at cross-examination. He asked the questions with the patience of someone who was building toward something, and what he was building toward was the admission that the marriage had been Elias's idea, arrived at specifically because of Mercer's legal claim, which Eleanor would not deny because they had agreed not to lie. So the marriage was proposed as a legal solution, Weld said. The marriage was proposed as a solution to a situation where I was being legally coerced, Eleanor said. Those are different things. Is that a yes or a no, Mrs. Boone? It's an answer, she said, which is what you asked for. Calloway looked at her over his reading glasses. She could not tell what he was thinking. Weld moved on. He asked about the household arrangement, about the original terms, about what exactly had changed and when. He asked his questions carefully, and she answered them carefully, and the courtroom was very quiet. Then, unexpectedly, Judge Calloway raised a hand. I'd like to hear from the child, he said. The courtroom stirred. Weld started to object, and Calloway looked at him with the patience of a man who had been done with nonsense since approximately 1870. I'm not asking for your opinion, Mr. Weld. Nathan stood up before anyone asked him to. He walked to the front of the room with his father's straight back and his mother's eyes, and the particular composure of a 12-year-old who has decided he is not going to be 12 in this moment, if he can help it. He stood in front of the judge and looked at him directly. Your Honor, he said, I'm Nathan Boone. I'm Elias Boone's son. Calloway looked at him over the glasses. I figured. Go ahead. Nathan was quiet for a second. Eleanor watched his jaw work slightly, the way it did when he was organizing words into the right order. Then he said, I didn't want her there when she came. I was as rude to her as I knew how to be. I thought she was using my father and I didn't trust her and I made sure she knew it. He paused. She stayed anyway. She fixed the windows and made food out of nothing and cleaned things that hadn't been cleaned in 2 years. And she didn't complain and she didn't perform at us. She just worked. And she was honest with me when she could have just told me what I wanted to hear. The courtroom was completely silent. My mother's been gone for 2 years, Nathan said, in the voice that went flat when he was managing something large. This isn't about replacing her. This is about my father stopping punishing himself for being alive, and my sister having someone to pin her drawings up, and he stopped, swallowed. She walked into a blizzard to find my father when nobody else did. She stayed in a house where people were throwing rocks through the windows and nobody decent would have blamed her for leaving. His eyes went to the Mercer side of the room briefly, then back to the judge. That man, a tilt of his head toward Calvin, didn't want her, told her so in front of the whole town. My father did want her, married her legally, and now we're here because that man is embarrassed. His jaw was tight. That's what I wanted to say. He walked back to his seat. Nobody said anything for 5 full seconds. Then Lily, from the bench, said in a carrying 7-year-old voice, I want her to be my mother. Someone in the courtroom made a sound, not a laugh. Something shorter and less controlled than that. Calloway was looking at his desk. He appeared to be examining a point about 2 feet in front of him with great attention. He did this for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then Elias stood up. He did not wait to be called. He stood up and said, in the steady, quiet voice Eleanor had come to understand, meant he had decided something and was now simply reporting the decision. Your Honor, I married this woman because she needed protection from a man who was trying to use a legal document to coerce her. That was the practical reason. But I want the record to show that it is no longer the only reason. I can't imagine my house without her. That's not a legal argument, but it's the truth of it. The courtroom was very still. Calvin Mercer was looking at his table. Judge Calloway pushed his reading glasses up, looked at both tables, looked at Nathan and Lily on the bench, looked at Eleanor, who was looking straight ahead with her hands folded and her face entirely composed and her heart going at a rate she chose not to examine. He ruled in 20 minutes. The contract was unenforceable. The marriage was legally valid. The petition was denied. Calvin Mercer lost. Eleanor sat in the wooden chair and heard the ruling and felt it move through her the way large things move. Not dramatically, not with the swell of music, but with the specific settling weight of a thing that is over. Her hands unclenched in her lap. She hadn't known they'd been clenched. Elias put his hand over hers on the table. She turned her hand over and held on. Behind them, Lily said to Nathan in a whisper that was not really a whisper, "Did we win?" "Yes," Nathan said. "Good," said Lily, and then she reached up and put her wooden rabbit on Eleanor's shoulder, which was her particular form of celebration. And Eleanor felt it there, small and light and utterly irreplaceable. And she thought about all the forms that home could take. This one, it turned out, had a broken window that had been fixed, a lopsided loaf of bread that tasted fine, a boy who had walked 2.5 miles in the cold to sit behind her in a courtroom, and a little girl who thought 6 legs made a horse faster. It was not what she'd planned. It was the first thing in her life that she hadn't needed to plan. Calvin Mercer left Blackridge on a Friday. Eleanor didn't see him go. She heard about it from George Pullman, who stopped by the cabin that afternoon with a sack of flour he said he'd been meaning to deliver, which was a kindness dressed as an errand, and mentioned in passing that Mercer had settled his affairs and taken the morning train east. No announcement, no scene, just a man quietly removing himself from a situation that had stopped serving him. George set the flour on the kitchen counter and accepted a cup of coffee and said, "Thought you'd want to know." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "Town's going to be different now," he said, in the careful way he said things. "Not entirely different, but some." She looked at him. George Pullman was 61 years old and had lived in Blackridge his whole life and understood its mechanics better than most. "Agnes Whitmore isn't going anywhere," she said. "No," he agreed. "But Agnes Whitmore lost a public ruling, which is the one thing that actually costs her something in this town. Her opinion carries less weight than it did." He drank his coffee. "People who were quiet before might be less quiet now." She nodded. She understood what he was telling her. Not that everything was fixed, but that the landscape had shifted. The rock through the window, the anonymous notes, the cold shoulders at the general store, those things didn't disappear because a judge had ruled. People didn't reorganize their convictions based on court decisions. But the particular cruelty that had been directed at her had been powered partly by the assumption that she was temporary, that she was a problem that would resolve itself by leaving. That assumption was gone now. She was not temporary. After George left, she stood in the kitchen for a while thinking about that word. Permanent. It sat differently than she'd expected. Not heavy, exactly. More like the feeling of setting something down after carrying it a long time and realizing how much it weighed only once your hands were free. She had been provisional her entire life. A rented room, a temporary job, a plan that was always pointing toward some future stability that kept receding. She had gotten very good at not putting down roots because roots got torn up, and torn up roots hurt worse than never having planted anything. She looked at Lily's drawings on the kitchen wall. There were 7 of them now, graduated from the wall in her small room to the kitchen where the whole household could see them. She looked at the shelf where the salt was in the right place, and the flour below it, and the dried herbs in the jars she'd labeled in her handwriting. She looked at the crack in the chair seat that she'd glued and clamped last week, and that held fine now, not invisible but functional. She had put things down here, quietly, incrementally, without fully acknowledging it. They were still standing. The weeks after the hearing had a different texture than the weeks before it. The immediate pressure was gone, which created a strange spaciousness, like a sound you've been living with for so long you've stopped hearing it, and then it stops, and the silence is almost disorienting. Eleanor caught herself waiting for the next thing, the next threat, the next anonymous note, and it didn't come, and gradually she stopped waiting for it. What came instead was ordinary life, which was, she was learning, not a lesser thing. Elias and she were figuring out what they were to each other in the way people figure things out when they've said the true thing and can't unsay it, carefully, without rushing, with the particular imprecision of 2 adults who have both been hurt enough to be cautious. They were not performing at each other. They were just present, sharing the evenings, talking about the workshop orders and the household accounts, and Nathan's schoolwork and Lily's drawings, and sometimes talking about other things, quieter things, things that required more trust. He told her about Sarah on a Sunday evening in February, when the children were in bed and the fire was low and the talking had gone the way it sometimes did. Deeper than either of them planned, following the logic of honesty rather than comfort. He didn't tell it like a story with a shape. He told it the way you tell something you've been carrying in pieces. This detail and then that one. Not in order, not for effect. The fever that came fast and took her in 4 days. The specific morning after, when he'd made coffee out of habit and stood there holding 2 cups before he understood. The way Nathan had not cried for 2 weeks and then cried for approximately 1 continuous day, and how Elias had sat on the floor of the loft with him and said nothing because there was nothing, and that had been the right thing even though it felt like failure. Eleanor listened. She didn't offer comfort in the form of summary or resolution. She just listened, which was what the telling required. I kept the house the way she had it for almost a year, he said. Everything in the same place. I told myself it was for the children, but it was for me. He looked at the fire. When you moved the salt that first week, I stood in front of the shelf for a full minute. I offered to move it back, she said. I know. A pause. I didn't want you to. That was the first time I understood I was doing it for me, not them. He was quiet for a moment. Moving on felt like saying she didn't matter enough to stay in place. It didn't mean that, Eleanor said. I know that now. He looked at her. I knew it then too, really. I just didn't know how to act on it without someone. He stopped. Without someone being there, she said. Yes, she understood this. She understood it the specific way you understand things you've lived through from a different angle. She'd had the opposite problem, not staying too long in the shape of what was gone, but running from shape altogether, keeping everything provisional so there was nothing to lose. 2 different kinds of fear, same result, alone. She would have liked you, Elias said. He said it with the careful weight of someone who had thought about whether to say it for a long time. That's not something I say to be kind. Sarah had very little patience for performance. She would have found you worth knowing. Eleanor looked at the fire. She thought about a woman she would never meet, who had left a cabin cold and 2 children and a husband who stood at a coffee-stained stove holding 2 cups. She thought about the wooden rabbit Lily carried everywhere, worn soft from years of handling. She thought about the way Nathan sometimes, when he was very tired, got an expression that Eleanor suspected was his mother's expression, surfacing through the boy's face like light through water. Thank you, she said. She meant it completely. He reached over and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture, child. Just a hand finding another hand in the firelight, the way hands do when the words run out and the feeling hasn't. They sat like that for a while. Outside, February did what February does in the mountains. Pressed cold against every window, moved through the pines, made the cabin feel like the only warm thing in the world. Which was not nothing. Nathan's thaw, when it came fully, came the way Nathan did everything, without ceremony or announcement, in the form of action rather than declaration. It was a Saturday in early March, and Elias was in the workshop with a commission that had a deadline, and Eleanor was in the kitchen with a pot of stew and the accounts ledger, and Nathan came downstairs and stood at the kitchen doorway and said, I want to learn the books. She looked up. The household accounts, he said. Father's hopeless at them. I'm better at numbers than he is. I should learn it. She looked at him, 13 now, having had a birthday in January that they'd marked with a cake that came out better than the first attempts. He was taller than he'd been in November. Not by much, but she'd noticed. Sit down, she said. She spent 2 hours teaching him the ledger system she'd developed, and he was right. He was better at numbers than Elias, quick and precise, catching an error she'd made in the February column before she'd pointed it out. He asked good questions. He didn't pretend to understand things he didn't. At the end of it, he pushed the ledger back and said, looking at the table, I want to tell you something. All right, I wasn't fair to you at the start. He said it without the elaborate wind-up of someone performing an apology. Just the fact, stated plainly. I knew you needed somewhere to go, and I made it harder than I needed to. That wasn't... He paused. That wasn't good. She looked at him for a moment. You were protecting your family, she said. I understood that. I was also just being mean. He said it with a Nathan kind of precision. I know the difference. I was protecting, and I was also being mean, and the second one wasn't necessary. She thought about the lopsided bread and the silent suppers and the arms crossed in the kitchen doorway. You came to the courthouse, she said. That's not the same as apologizing. No, she agreed, but it counts for something. He nodded. He picked up the pencil and put it down. Then he said, looking at the accounts ledger, What do I call you? The question again. She'd told him whatever feels right back in December, and he had called her nothing since then, had navigated the absence of a name with the ingenuity of someone solving a lateral problem. She thought about it now the way she hadn't let herself think about it before. What she wanted him to call her. Not the practical answer or the protective answer, but the true one. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I think that might be something we figure out together. He looked at her. His jaw worked slightly. Then he said, with the air of a person making a concession they've been considering for some time, Eleanor is fine. For now. She nodded. Eleanor is fine. It was not Mother. It was not the warm, resolved ending of a story with a tidy arc. It was a 13-year-old boy calling a woman by her first name and meaning more by it than he was ready to say. She understood that completely, and she took it for what it was, which was more than she'd had at the start, and honestly more than she'd expected to get this fast. Spring came in fits and starts the way mountain springs do. Warm for 3 days, and then a freeze, mud, and then sun, and then another cold snap that felt personal. Eleanor planted a kitchen garden in the patch of ground south of the cabin that got the most light, which Elias had said she could have if she wanted it, and she worked it on the mornings when the ground was soft enough, turning the soil with a spade that had a cracked handle she wrapped in leather cord. It was not a beautiful garden. She had no illusions about this. She had grown up in cities and learned gardening from a pamphlet, and from watching an old woman at a rooming house in Ohio who had grown the best tomatoes Eleanor had ever tasted. The rows were not straight. The first planting of beans did not come up, which she attributed to the late cold snap, and she replanted them with the specific stubbornness of someone who had decided this particular patch of ground was going to cooperate. Lily helped, with the enthusiasm and destructive energy of a 7-year-old who has been told she can help. She planted seeds in her own small section and checked them every morning and reported their progress, or lack of it, with the seriousness of a scientist. Nothing is happening, Lily announced one morning in April, crouching over her section. It takes time, Eleanor said. How much time? A few weeks. Lily looked at the bare dirt with deep suspicion. What is it doing underground? Getting ready, Eleanor said. Lily considered this. That seems like a lot of preparation for just being a bean. Eleanor kept working. Most things take more preparation than they look like they need from the outside. She wasn't only talking about beans. Lily wasn't old enough to know that, which was fine. Elias came out one evening and stood at the edge of the garden and looked at it with his carpenter's eye, the one that assessed structure and potential simultaneously. You know that South Corner gets too much direct afternoon sun, he said. I know, she said. I moved the tomatoes. He looked at where she'd moved them. That'll work. I know. He looked at her with that almost smile he had. You don't actually need my opinion. No, she said, but I like it sometimes. He came and sat on the fence post at the edge of the garden, and they stayed out there until the light changed and the mountains went purple, and Lily called them in for supper with the authority of a 7-year-old who had decided she was now in charge of announcing meals. There were things that didn't get easier, and Eleanor thought it was important to know that. She thought it was the most important thing, actually. The thing that took her the longest to learn, and that she was still learning. The idea that certain things don't resolve, they just become part of the texture of living. The town was better, and also not better. Agnes Whitmore had receded from active hostility into a cold civility that was almost worse in its specificity. She would acknowledge Eleanor in the street with the precise minimum of acknowledgement that social convention required, no more. There were families who warmed toward them after the hearing and families who didn't, and the families who didn't were not going to, and Eleanor made her peace with that the way you make peace with weather. You dress for it. You don't let it stop you from going outside. The general store woman, whose name turned out to be Marta, had shifted from suspicious to neutral by March and to something approaching conversational by April. It had started when Eleanor noticed Marta's youngest child had a persistent cough and mentioned that boiling water with dried thyme and a little honey had helped Lily through the winter, which was not a medical recommendation, just a thing that had worked. Marta had tried it, and it had helped, and she'd mentioned it to Eleanor the next time she came in, and they talked for 4 minutes about children's coughs and the uselessness of various patent medicines, and that had been the beginning of a careful, practical rapport that suited them both. Not friendship, exactly, but not nothing. Eleanor had learned to distinguish between those two things. She'd spent years thinking that not friendship was not worth anything, that the only thing that counted was the deep, certain, unconditional kind. She'd been wrong about that. The careful, earned, partial kinds. The George Pullmans, and the Martas, and the Agnes Whitmore has receded. Those were their own form of community. They were what a life was actually made of, most of the time. The deep certainties were rare, and you kept them like the good dishes, and the careful partials were the everyday ones you used every day, and they mattered too. She was thinking about this on an evening in July when Elias found her on the porch. She'd been sitting there watching the last of the light leave the mountains, which she had developed the habit of doing when the evenings permitted it. The heat of the day was still in the porch boards under her, and the air had gone the soft, warm blue of a mountain summer evening, and Nathan and Lily were somewhere in the yard. She could hear Lily's voice and Nathan's lower response, some argument about the rules of a game they'd invented. Elias came out and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, which was a thing they did now without planning it. Lily's beans came up, he said. I know. She told me approximately 40 times today. She told me the beans were ready because they finished preparing underground. Eleanor looked at him. I thought it was interesting, he said. I told her that in April. I know, she remembered, his shoulder warm against hers. She has a good memory for the things that matter to her. They were quiet for a while. The mountains held the last light the way they did, going from gold to pink to that deep, saturated purple that Eleanor had not seen anywhere else, and had not expected to love as specifically as she did. She thought about the train, the one she'd arrived on in November, stepping out into the cold with $14 and no plan and a worn coat with mismatched thread. She thought about the platform and the bench at the end of it and the icy water trough, and a man in a carpenter's apron standing at a respectful distance saying, You have somewhere to stay tonight? 8 months. The distance between that bench and this porch was 8 months, and also, she understood now, essentially her entire life, because everything before it had been preparation of a kind. All the rented rooms and failed plans and cities that didn't fit, the whole long accumulation of not quite right, had been pointing here without her knowing it. That was not something she could have seen from the bench. You couldn't see it until you were sitting on the other side of it. Can I tell you something? She said. Always, he said. I was so angry on that platform. She'd never told him the full texture of it. She'd told him the facts. Not just at Mercer. At myself, for having believed it would work. For having gotten on the train at all. I kept thinking, this is what you get for hoping. This is what happens when you let yourself need something. Elias was quiet, listening. And then you walked up and asked me a practical question, she said. You didn't offer me sympathy. You didn't look at me like I was something broken. You just said, do you have somewhere to stay? Like it was a solvable problem. She paused. I didn't know how much I needed that. Someone treating it like a solvable problem. He looked at her. In the blue evening light, his face was the face she'd been memorizing for months without entirely meaning to. The gray at the temples, the lines around his eyes, the way his jaw was always slightly tighter on the left side from an old injury he'd mentioned once, and not again. I saw someone who was handling something very hard and wasn't falling apart about it, he said. That was what I noticed. Not the circumstance. You. She looked out at the mountains. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Not the idealized version of yourself, not the version you'd like to present, but the actual one. Tired face and fraying coat, and $14, and the anger you're keeping below the surface so it doesn't show. She'd been invisible for most of her life in the specific way that women without money or position or powerful names are invisible. Not dramatically, just not worth looking at carefully. He had looked at her carefully from the beginning. Nathan called me Eleanor today, she said. Elias smiled. Not the almost smile. The real one, which still surprised her with how much it changed his face. I heard. You heard? I was in the hall. I wasn't eavesdropping, I just heard. And? I was quiet for a moment. His mother used to say that Nathan showed you where he stood by what he did, not what he said, that you had to learn to read the action. He paused. Calling you by your name instead of nothing. That's Nathan saying something. She understood this. She'd been learning to read Nathan for months, the whole vocabulary of him, the extra place at the table, the ledger, the courthouse, the apology that was 2 sentences and completely meant. She was still learning it, and she expected to be still learning it for years, which did not frighten her the way it would have frightened her in November. She had time now. She had somewhere to put the learning. Lily appeared at the edge of the porch, grass-stained and pleased with herself about something. Nathan said I was wrong about the rules, she announced. Were you? Eleanor said. Lily considered this with great seriousness. Probably, she said. But I was more interesting. She disappeared back into the yard. Eleanor and Elias sat with that for a second, and then he laughed. The real laugh, the one that had surprised her the first time she heard it in December. The one that made him look like the younger man he'd been before grief had settled into the lines of him. She laughed too. It wasn't anything profound. It was just a 7-year-old's absolute commitment to being more interesting than being correct. And it was funny, and it was theirs. Later, after the children were in bed, and the house was settling into its nighttime sounds, Eleanor stood in her room, the small room off the kitchen, which was still hers, which she still thought of as hers, even as the rest of the house had become hers too in a different way. And she looked at the drawings on the wall. There were 14 of them now. Horses with various numbers of legs, the cabin in summer with flowers that didn't exist yet, a drawing of 4 figures that had been made in winter and was already out of date in the best possible way because the figures looked like them, the tall one and the medium one and the 2 smaller ones, all in front of the cabin with smoke from the chimney, and one she hadn't seen before. New, at the end of the row, done in Lily's recent style, which had gotten considerably more detailed since spring. It was a woman in a garden, kneeling in the dirt with a spade. The rows were not straight. The woman's hair was coming loose from whatever she'd tied it back with. There were beans, with exactly the right number of leaves, which was new, coming up in their own small section. And at the top of the drawing, in Lily's careful letters, it said, Eleanor in her garden. Not the garden, her garden. Eleanor stood there looking at it for a long time. She thought about all the things she had lost or never had, the permanence she'd never been able to hold on to, the home that had always been just a word until now. She thought about the cost of the getting here, the humiliation and the cold and the broken windows and the nights awake counting what could go wrong. And she thought that it would be a very clean kind of thinking to say it had all been worth it, that suffering has a purpose if it leads somewhere good. She didn't think that exactly. She thought, the bad things happened, and then other things happened, and the other things became this. And this is real, and mine and I am not leaving. Those were not the same as saying suffering was worth it. They were better than that, actually. They were the truth without the gloss. The acknowledgement that the hard parts were just hard, that they didn't need to have been necessary or instructive or secretly a gift. They happened. And here, on the other side of them, was a garden with imperfect rows, and a child who remembered what you said in April, and a boy who was learning the household accounts, and a man who had handed her a lamp and walked her home through blizzard aftermath. Here was enough. Here was more than enough. She pinned the drawing to the wall. Her garden, the imperfect rows, the beans that had taken their time underground. And she turned off the lamp and lay down in the narrow bed that had been hers since November, and listened to the mountain sounds outside, the pines, the wind, the particular quiet of a summer night in a place that had become familiar. She did not fall asleep thinking about the future. She did not run the contingencies or plan the next move. She was not that person right now, in this house, on this particular evening in July. She was just Eleanor Boone, in a house where she was wanted, listening to the sounds of a life that had taken almost everything she had to build. It was not perfect. It was perfectly hers. And in the end, after all of it, the train and the platform and the cold bench and the blizzard and the broken window and the courtroom and the slow, imperfect rebuilding of something she hadn't known she was building, that was the thing she had been looking for all along. Not a place that had no problems. A place that was worth staying for them.